Hello and a very warm welcome to the channel. I have got another History Oversimplified video for you guys today. So last time we did the French Revolution Oversimplified Part 1, which I really enjoyed. I learned a lot. So naturally we're now doing Part 2. It's possibly an inappropriate day. So I'm filming this on the 2nd of June. In the UK we have today and tomorrow off as bank holidays. Essentially a 4-day weekend for the Platinum Jubilee. And I'm going to spend that time watching a documentary about a monarch being executed. So make of that what you will. No, don't. If you're watching Queen, you're safe. But yeah, I think it should be really interesting. If you haven't already, please do subscribe and let's go. Part 2.
King Louis and his family were now in the Tuileries Palace in Paris, where for the next couple of years, he watched as the revolutionary government began to strip away his power. And fearing for his safety, he had to stay on their good side. Hey, look who it is. It's my favorite revolutionaries. Yep, I'm your #1 fan. What can I do for you? Hey, King Louis. So we've made a few decisions. First, all of your friends in the nobility are going to have to pay taxes the same as everyone else.
Seems
Great
fair.
idea.
Yes.
I love it. And as a side note, the tax money can no longer pay for all your lavish parties. Great. I hate those parties. They're so awkward.
So, like, imagine how humiliating it must be for Louis XVI. He goes from being like a near god, someone who was chosen, as far as he's concerned, by God to rule France, an absolute ruler, to playing second fiddle to this bunch of revolutionaries. Like, the humiliation must have been out of this world.
And also, we're taking away your Porsche. Oh, come on! I mean,
Yay!
the king continually found demand after demand
Go
being
to
made of him
bed.
to prove his support for the revolution. On one occasion, a mob would invade the palace and demand he wear the revolutionary bonnet. This is the face of a man who is definitely pretending he wants to wear that bonnet. Around here.
Yes, they really encapsulated that. Yeah, I'll just go back to that picture. That is the perfect representation of a man who would rather be literally anywhere else in the world than wearing that slightly strange beanie thing on his head.
Who is definitely pretending he wants to wear that bonnet. Now around here, I want to mention that one thing King Louis had a problem with was people constantly raiding his palace. But one thing he didn't have a problem with was raiding noobs on this video's sponsor, Raid Shadow Legends. Raid Shadow Legends is a brand new collection RPG game with amazing...
I love the idea of Louis XVI playing this game, playing Raid Shadow Legends. How cool would that be? Perhaps if he'd had this game, he would have spent less time being a terrible ruler and wouldn't have got overthrown. So, if you're a bit like a terrifying dictator and you're watching this, please play this game and reduce the chance you get overthrown in a violent revolution. Now, let's go.
Click on the special links and you will instantly get 50,000 silver and a free epic champion.
And you get an epic champion! What more could you want? And 50,000 silver, which sounds like a lot. Go play this game.
Oh yeah. Seeing the
Visual
situation
guy.
rapidly turning against him, the king decided it might be a good idea to leave France and mount a campaign to retake his country from abroad. Luckily
Okay.
for him, he was married to an Austrian. So on the night of June 20th, 1791, the king and his family disguised themselves as servants and attempted to flee to the Austrian Netherlands. The royal carriage made a stop in the town of Varennes, and the postmaster there was like, "Hey guys, what's up? Where are you off to? We are but a collection of inconspicuous servants heading for the border for no particular reason at all." Say, you, the fat one, you look kind of familiar. Aren't you the king? Nope. Let me see your passport. It says here you're King Louis XVI. Nope, not me. Take him away, boys. The king was promptly returned to Paris, but now the jig was up.
Yeah.
His lack of support for the revolution was clear to all.
So this is like an open rebellion against the revolution by Louis XVI.
And many considered him a straight-up traitor who tried to abandon his people.
It reminds me a lot of the end of the First English Civil War. Because originally the plan wasn't to execute Charles I, who was the King of England at the time. And the parliamentarians didn't really want to do that. But Charles I then ran away and made alliance with Scotland and then invaded England with a Scottish army. And at that point, he was regarded as a traitor and was later executed. So it's kind of similar in that this guy he probably could have got away with possibly being like a constitutional monarch. But rather than do that, he went to a foreign power and tried to use them, or tried to go to a foreign power and use them to restore his absolute power. And I think it's going to end choppy. But yeah, there's a definite parallel.
As a result, the new constitution of 1791 completely reduced his powers to that of a simple figurehead, a constitutional monarch. However, radicals, such as those in the Jacobin Club, were outraged that the king wasn't to be removed entirely. So a month later, these radicals staged a protest on the Champ de Mars, calling for the king's removal. The government of Paris feared an insurrection was mounting, and they sent the military to disperse the crowd. The confrontation escalated and resulted in the Revolutionary National Guard firing on a crowd of revolutionaries. It was a massacre. The incident exposed a deep division.
It's like crazy how many revolutions end up with the revolutionaries having to kill other revolutionaries to defend the revolution. So it's like in the Russian Revolution in February 1917, that government then had to fight the Bolsheviks, like the July Days Crisis, for example, which it lost. Then the Bolsheviks, once they took power, had to fight, for example, the Kronstadt Mutiny, which they crushed. So yeah, it seems that you're a revolutionary up until the point where you have power, and then you have to crush other revolutionaries. Seems to be how most of history works.
Within the Brotherhood of the Revolution. On one side, the moderates who wanted to keep the king as a figurehead. On the other, radicals who wanted to see the king deposed and heads roll. In the wake of the massacre, these radicals received a wave of support. And speaking of rolling heads, one form of equality the revolution introduced was equality in execution. This meant no more torturous drawing and quartering, no more inhumane...
And that's it. Being hung, drawn, and quartered is a horrendous way to execute someone. You hang them till they're nearly dead, then you kind of pull out their entrails. Then almost mercifully, you chop them up into different bits. Often you send the different bits to different parts of the country as a warning to others. So getting rid of that was definitely a good thing.
Main hanging. They wanted all criminals, regardless of economic status, to receive the same penalty, a quick and painless one. Luckily, a man by the name of Dr. Joseph Guillotine
I see where this is going.
A heavy blade that falls like thunder.
Imagine your legacy being that, like, a form of execution is named after you. That would be, it's quite the boast in both a good and bad way, but probably mainly bad.
The head flies off, blood spurts, and the man is no more. The guillotine, otherwise known as the national razor. The guillotine made its debut in 1791 as the new form of execution. The writings of Marat and others continued to call for the execution of anyone suspected of working against the revolution. For him, this included some members of the clergy and nobility who had previously benefited from the cruel system of inequality that existed before the revolution. In many parts of the countryside, local lords had found themselves become a target. Sire, the peasants, they're revolting. Oh, come on, that's a bit harsh. Sure, they smell a bit, but I wouldn't say they're revolting.
Yeah.
Oh, yes, I see what you mean. Increasingly, these French aristocrats began fleeing France to find solitude in other parts of Europe. And once again, fear began to take hold. The privileged classes of these foreign nations didn't like what they were seeing because they feared revolutionary ideas may spread to their own lands. The National Assembly, actually now the Legislative Assembly, feared...
So this is a really important point, I think, is that refugees from kind of aristocratic refugees from France went all over Europe, and they basically told all the other European countries how terrible the French revolutionaries are, how they must be crushed, and how if you don't do something about these guys, you're going to have the same thing, or you could have the same thing in your country. And that is going to lead to several decades of war.
That these nations may decide to attack. Then why don't we attack them first? No, you idiots, we are definitely not ready for war yet. Did somebody say something? France declared war in Austria in April 1792 and immediately got pummeled. It also didn't help that Austria's ally, Prussia, joined in the fighting. The Prussian Duke of Brunswick posted a letter warning the revolutionaries that if anything happened to the king, he would burn Paris to the ground. The Duke's letter proved to be a massive success in inspiring the people of Paris to do the exact opposite of what he intended. They were enraged by the threat, and on the 10th of August 1792, the tension in the city exploded, and a mob stormed the king's palace. Fighting broke out between the revolutionaries and the king's Swiss guard, with casualties in the hundreds. King Louis fled and took refuge in the chamber of the Legislative Assembly, where Robespierre and his radical Jacobins were gaining ever more power. Given the developing situation, the chamber
That sounds like it might not have been a very smart decision.
decided to hold a vote, and in what some considered to be a second revolution, it was decided to suspend the monarchy entirely. King Louis XVI was now just plain old Louis, and he was sent to a prison.
And like you can imagine the shock for, the rest of Europe. So at this time, the idea of a major European country not being led by a monarch was just insane. It made no sense to a huge number of people. It's not like our own time when we have lots of republics. This is kind of one of the first prominent ones. I suppose the United States would be an even earlier one. But for the old order of Europe, this was terrifying and crazy. And you can kind of see why they reacted in the way they did.
Prison cell where an eye could be kept on him. A month later, the newly established National Convention officially declared the French Republic, and society underwent a massive change. Enlightened ideas of democracy and equality were being implemented, but very quickly, these ideas seemed to become secondary to fear, paranoia, and a thirst for blood. The new republic began working to violently remove any semblance of the old royalist regime. The church became a prime target. Priests who refused to take an oath to the revolution were deported or arrested. A new state-sponsored atheist...
So, as we saw in the first video, I think the clergy was one of the key institutions which upheld the kind of the monarchical regime. And that was the case in a lot of European countries. So there's a lot of European countries where the clergy became targets. So I mean, during the Spanish Civil War, for example, which wasn't actually an attempted revolution, but it kind of turned into one as well. The various different far left groups really went out of their way to target and kill members of the clergy. So yeah, and same with the Russian Revolution. So you can kind of see that the clergy are regarded as almost the propagandists of the old order.
Religion named the Cult of Reason was created as a replacement for the Catholic Church. Notre Dame, along with many other churches, had their religious treasures destroyed and were converted to temples of reason. Even the Christian calendar didn't survive, as a brand new revolutionary calendar was soon introduced. Hey honey, I'm home. Yeah, whatever, jerk. Whoa, what's wrong with you? You forgot. Forgot what? Everything. This entire year. My birthday was on the 3rd of Germinal. Our anniversary was the 12th of Thermidor, and you promised that in Frimaire we'd go on a romantic weekend trip to Venice. No, I said we'd do that in December. December hasn't been a thing for years. The government of Paris, now under the control of the radical sans-culottes, began rounding up suspected enemies of the revolution and sending them to prison in the thousands. Naturally, a large number of those arrested were members of the clergy and aristocracy. As France's foreign enemies continued to close in, panic spread. Georges Danton made impassioned calls for men to defend the Republic, and tens of thousands of troops left Paris for the front lines. However, in their absence, Paris was left to its own devices. As enemy troops arrived in Verdun, the people of Paris feared that their crowded prisons were becoming a breeding ground for counter-revolutionary conspiracy. What would happen if the Prussians reached Paris and freed the aristocrats? Marat believed he knew what would happen. The aristocrats would enact their vengeance on the people.
I mean, in fairness, he's almost certainly right on that point.
Fearing those they had already imprisoned, mobs descended on Paris's prisons. They broke in, and during the brutal September Massacres, aristocrats, priests, and others were tried and executed on the spot. Even women and children weren't spared. With over 1,600 victims.
What this is reminding me of is, which is the last of the Christopher Nolan Batman films, the one with Bane in it. Kind of reminds me of Bane. Bane is like a really hunky version of Robespierre. Bane is like Robespierre combined with Chuck Norris, basically. I know I'm murdering the pronunciation. Robespierre? Or whatever it is.
Word of the massacre spread across Europe. One British newspaper wondered, are these the rights of man? Is this the liberty of human nature? But there was still one man in particular that Robespierre and his radicals really wanted to see executed. Austria and Prussia pledged that after they defeated France, they'd return King Louis to the throne.
Yeah.
Well, checkmate Austria and Prussia, because you can't return a man to the throne if he's already dead. Citizen Louis Capet was put on trial for treason. Obviously, he was found guilty, but his punishment was less certain. Many moderates wanted to simply deport him, but Robespierre insisted the revolution could only live if the king was dead. A vote was held, and by just one vote, Louis was sentenced to the guillotine.
I mean, certainly if Louis XVI had been sent into exile, for as long as he is in exile, he would have been a threat to the new regime. That's true. Not saying he should have been executed, to be clear. I don't want anyone to die. But I can kind of understand the logic behind the decision.
If you don't mind, I'd like to say a few words first. Gentlemen, I am innocent of everything of which I am accused. Wait, you're too loud. They can't hear me. Hang on, I haven't finished yet. Wait, dude. I'm cool.
Yeah.
In her prison cell.
Is that how it really happens? Did he try and give a speech and was cut short? I don't know. If you know the answer, please comment below. I'll be really interested.
Marie Antoinette heard the guns fire, signaling her husband's death. Before long, she would meet the same fate. Back on the war front, France defied all expectations and actually managed to push the enemy back. But then more countries joined the coalition against France, and it all went to pot again. What do? Conscript the masses! The National Convention introduced a conscription law, with each regional department having to meet a certain quota of men for the army. However, Not everyone was happy with this new law.
I know I keep going on about this, but there's really strong parallels again with the Russian Civil War. So that this kind of new revolutionary government completely outraged all the old elites of Europe, and all of them kind of ganged up against Napoleon. So like Spain, France, Austria, Prussia, etc. Whereas in the Russian Civil War, pretty much all the major world powers tried to help the White Army, as they were called, the Russian nationalists against the Bolsheviks. So that includes Britain, the United States, Japan, France. All of them sent supplies and in some cases troops to help the nationalists. It didn't work, they lost. But you can kind of see the same kind of ideological conflict going on.
You see, while Paris was definitely a hotbed for radical revolutionary fervor, some of the regions outside of Paris weren't quite so keen on the revolution. Some were largely still conservative, still supported the church, and just didn't suffer from that much inequality before the revolution. So as the revolution turned increasingly violent and anti-Christian, many were outraged. Now they were being conscripted to fight for the new republic they hated. That was the last straw. Counter-revolutionary uprisings erupted in a number of regions across France. Some would last for years, such as in the northwest, where a large-scale uprising was led by the Owls. Why were they called the Owls? Because their leader was named Jean Owl. Why was he called Jean Owl? Possibly because he could do a really good impression of an owl. Really? That's what we're going with? Owls? Just because this guy can do an impression of one? Hit him with it, Jean. Hoot, hoot. Yeah, okay, that's pretty good.
In fairness, there are real political movements which have more ridiculous origin stories for their names. So, yeah, I can believe it. I'll accept it.
The Shrinery Uprising lasted all the way until 1800. In the summer of 1793, the southern city of Toulon invited the British Navy over for some tea and crumpets. And then they asked if they'd possibly like to stay and occupy the city. Being an important naval base, this was a heavy blow to the Republic, who sent a relatively unknown young captain by the name of Napoleon Bonaparte to help stage a siege of the city.
Here he comes.
Toulon was recaptured by France in the winter, and for his service, Napoleon was promoted to the rank of Brigadier General. The most infamous counter-revolution, however, occurred in the Vendée region. Throughout 1793, revolutionary forces clashed with the region's Catholic and Royal Army. The Republic defeated the counter-revolution through cruel pacification. In particular, General Jean-Baptiste Carrier committed brutal atrocities. In one instance, he had thousands of civilians, priests, women, and children tied to ships, which were then sunk.
Oh, that's
Carrier
horrible.
would later be found guilty of war crimes.
And this brutality, you can see, why it's terrifying all the other countries in Europe, but B, how it has like an immense political reaction within them. So, for example, British conservatism, it kind of owes its origin to Edmund Burke, who was a Tory MP. He wrote a book about the French Revolution. And he'd previously been quite sympathetic to the American Revolution, but the French Revolution just terrified him. And he wrote a book about sort of why this terrifying radical change was bad and why you could just have more incremental change. And it kind of became like almost a foundation document for even modern British conservatism.
Executed. Back in Paris, the government was still dominated by moderates. With the war going badly, revolts in the provinces, and the economy getting worse, it seemed the government just wasn't doing a very good job. Radicals' fear for the safety of the revolution intensified, and Marat even began calling for the moderates in the government to be executed. In return, the moderates called for the arrest of Marat.
Yes.
This led to a chain of events with the two sides in heated conflict. Robespierre declared the Jacobins to be an insurrection, and called on the people to arm themselves. It all ended on the 31st of May 1793, with the National Convention surrounded by radical sans-culottes and 29 moderate Girondin politicians arrested. From this moment on, the moderates ceased to be a political force. Robespierre and his radicals would be in almost total control of...
So this reminds me a lot of the Bolsheviks taking over from the provisional government, who were in turn revolutionaries, but were less radical revolutionaries.
The government.
In revolutionary Russia.
Brings us to the story of a woman named Charlotte Corday. Charlotte lived in the northwest city of Caen, and like many in the area, was horrified at the rapid radicalization and increasing violence of the revolution. And the man she blamed more than anyone was Jean-Paul Marat. She wanted to bring peace back to France, and so she did something drastic. She traveled to Paris and told Marat she had a list of enemies for him to publish in his paper. Marat eagerly invited her in for a meeting. So where's that list of enemies you promised me? Here it is. Wait a minute. This isn't a list of enemies. It just says, yippee-ki-yay. Just like that. Marat was no more.
Oh.
Charlotte was quickly arrested and sent to the guillotine. Her dream of restoring peace, however, died with her. Marat became a martyr. In temples of reason, symbols of the dead Marat became the new crucifix. In death, he became an even more powerful inspiration for the extreme levels of violence that were about to rip throughout the new republic. That's right, here comes the Reign of Terror.
Yeah,
If you
I
thought
knew
this
this was
revolution
coming.
already sounds pretty violent, well, you ain't seen nothing yet, son. The radicals were now in control, and they believed not only was France surrounded by foreign enemies, but that within the masses, there were also plenty of internal ones too. Individuals not loyal to the revolution, conspiring to bring about its downfall. Robespierre and the rest of the radical faction were having none of it. A new committee of public safety was established with 12 members. Its purpose was to protect the new French Republic from its enemies, and it basically became a 12-man dictatorship with Robespierre as its leading voice. The Revolutionary Tribunal was also reinstated, a special court created to streamline the process of trying suspected enemies and handing out their death sentences. With these two new institutions, Robespierre wanted to scare France's enemies straight. In September 1793, it was announced that terror would be the order of the day. In other words, fear had become official government policy. And from then onwards, we enter into the period known as the Reign of Terror. Spies and secret police were everywhere and watched the people closely. France's public had to be extremely careful what they said and how they behaved. Obviously, criticizing this new system, or the government, would quickly have you sent off to the guillotine. But that's not all. Even the most minor offense could have you tried before the Revolutionary Tribunal.
I mean, this I'm getting very strong kind of like Stalinist Russia or Maoist China vibes here. The complete, the revolutionaries' complete obsession about internal enemies, looking for internal enemies everywhere. Like any very moderate disagreement would get you executed. Even no disagreement could do, and they're just sort of like the paranoia about enemies within.
Hello, Citizen Martin. Hello, Monsieur Dubois. Monsieur? Did I just hear you say Monsieur? That's the old style of address, my friend. To the guillotine! You know what? I didn't like him, but I do feel kinda bad for the king and his family. Oof, expressing sympathy for the royal family, are we? To the guillotine! 12 sous for a loaf of bread? That's way overpriced. To the guillotine! Man, this bread line is taking forever. To the guillotine! And you look like you're thinking anti-revolutionary thoughts. To the guillotine. Max, we're sending way too many people to the guillotine. To the guillotine! Chop, 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 chop. It was insane. All across France, about 40,000 people were killed for suspected crimes against liberty. Let's say your neighbor won't stop mowing the lawn at 7 in the morning. Well, then all you gotta do is tell the government they've been talking smack about the revolution.
Yeah.
And there's a good chance they'll end up in front of the Revolutionary Tribunal. Maybe they'll even be executed, taking a metaphorical load off your shoulders and a literal one off theirs. The most prominent victim...
I mean, that's a really good point, is that in any authoritarian regime, I'm sure it still happens today, people can like denounce their neighbours due to personal grudges, and you can have them arrested, locked up, even in some cases executed. So yeah, don't mow your grass early in the morning if you live in a dictatorship. Basically, if in a democracy, do whatever you want. Do it at 2 a.m. for all I care. Well, I do care. Do it at 2 a.m. and you'll get away with it.
Victim of the Reign of Terror was a certain Marie Antoinette, who was finally tried and found guilty of treason.
I love like the at walk with her hair. That's fantastic. I love the little details in this channel.
1793. She expected she'd be brought to the guillotine in a royal carriage, fit for a queen. All the Republic could provide for her, however, was a wooden tumbril. At 37 years old, the most hated woman in French history met her end on the 16th of October, 1793. Robespierre had saved the revolution through terror. Internal dissent was being suppressed. The food situation was no longer quite as bad. Even the French military had got its act together again and pummeled the Allies at the Battle of Fleurus. For Danton and his followers, the time was right to try to normalize the French Republic. Hey Robespierre, so we were thinking that since things are finally going better, maybe we should rein in the terror. And while we're on it, we could possibly start taking it easier on the church. And also try to end this costly war. Oh, crap. As time went on...
I shouldn't laugh. I had a feeling that was what was going to come.
Robespierre seemed to go, for lack of a better term, a bit mental. He was hell-bent on creating what he called a republic of virtue. And for him, this meant amping up the bloodshed even more. Throughout the spring and summer of 1794, executions reached an unprecedented level, during a period known as the Great Terror. Even those closest to him found their way to the guillotine if they dared oppose his ideas and actions, and he began alienating himself from...
Again, I'm getting really strong Stalinist vibes from this. I mean, so like in post-revolutionary Russia, particularly after Stalin took over, the most dangerous thing you could be was a senior Bolshevik. Well, apart from like an overt counter-revolutionary, because I mean, so many of the senior Bolsheviks were executed by Stalin on often ridiculous charges. And yeah, the closer you were to Stalin, to some extent, the more in danger you were. And it kind of seems like it's similar with this guy.
The rest of the convention, he created a new deistic religion called the Cult of the Supreme Being, along with the new annual Festival of the Supreme Being. Man, I think Robespierre is really starting to lose it. He thinks he's a god or something. Nonsense. Sure, he's gone a little extreme, but he doesn't think he's a god. My children, bathe your immortal souls in the virtue of my republic. Okay, yeah, he's completely lost it. Robespierre's ultimate mistake, however, came on July 26th, when he made a speech to the National Convention, in which he said this: "I have in my hand a brand new list of enemies to be sent to the guillotine, and many of you are on this list, but I'm not going to tell you who yet." What do you think of that?
What?
I think we should send Robespierre to the guillotine first.
Yeah.
All in favor? No. 2 days later.
I shouldn't laugh. The fate of Robespierre, I'm really bad at pronouncing the name. It reminds me a lot of Stalin's secret police chiefs. So many of them were executed. They would execute huge numbers of people, then eventually they would get executed. Then the new guy would execute loads of people, then eventually he would get executed. And I'm getting really strong parallels of that and this situation in France.
Robespierre became the final victim of the monstrous terror and paranoia he had created. Many historical accounts of the revolution end here, with the death of Robespierre and his terror. But the revolution officially continued for another 5 years, until 1799. So what happened between now and then? Well, after the fall of Robespierre, a more moderate political group called the Thermidorians took control of the convention.
Okay.
They wanted to restore stability to the government. Now, Robespierre's allies and other radicals who had fueled the terror themselves became the target of political suppression. Bourgeois street fighters took on the radical sans-culottes in the streets during a period named the White Terror. In 1795, the Thermidorians drafted a new...
So white is often used as a kind of phrase for counter-revolutionary. Like we were talking earlier, in the Russian Civil War, the White Armies were the anti-Bolshevik armies, were kind of wanted to more maintain the status quo.
Constitution, and created a government called the Directory, with the purpose of preventing power from being able to fall into the hands of a single individual again. As this new government was being established, royalists who wanted to bring the monarchy back to France saw this moment as an opportunity to strike. They staged an insurrection in Paris and battled with the National Guard in the streets. Luckily, one Napoleon Bonaparte happened to be in Paris at the time, and he took control of the situation, firing on the crowd and putting down the insurrection. From this moment on, the people of Paris would never again be able to stage a popular uprising and lost their control over the revolution.
So I suppose from that you can tell that, I mean, as crazy as he was, Robespierre, and whilst I'm not justifying his violence at all, he clearly was right that there was a counter-revolutionary threat, because as soon as he's off the scene and kind of his radicals are off the scene, there's an attempted monarchist coup. So that's interesting. I mean, whilst his violence was horrendous and I don't think can be justified, you can kind of see why he did it.
For his actions, Napoleon became a general and was sent to take control of the French armies in Italy.
Yeah.
The new directory...
And interesting, Napoleon was very lucky not to fall victim to the terror himself. It just happened he was out of Paris during some of the key moments. And it, obviously, if he had fallen victim, history would be very different.
Remained a fairly ineffective government for the remainder of the revolution. It was plagued with corruption and struggled to keep the economy afloat, and as a result, wasn't very popular. For the people of France, with the strict social customs of both royalist France and the terror gone, they didn't really know what to do with themselves. Men no longer removed their hats when talking to women. Different classes began intermingling, and a publication began circulating that looked a lot like a modern dating app. It was social anarchy. Outside of France, the war continued. In 1795,
Might have to have a go on this dating app.
France took the Netherlands, where they set up a puppet state. Then they negotiated both Prussia and Spain out of the war. The British attempted to land French royalists in the west to reinforce rebellion, but that plan failed. In 1796, the French planned a three-pronged attack with the aim of marching on Vienna and knocking Austria out of the war. The two northern armies were defeated and forced to retreat. However, Napoleon in the south, with groundbreaking military strategy, won battle after battle after battle. He pushed the Austrians out of Italy and began closing in on Vienna. The Austrians freaked out, and Napoleon oversaw the signing of a peace treaty. He had almost single-handedly knocked Austria out.
I mean, the dude was a genius. That no one can contest that.
Of the war. And by the way, he was only 28, so maybe it's about time you moved out of your mom's basement. Napoleon became a famed hero among the French people, but his
I feel that that's aimed at me personally. I'm taking that as a personal slight. Justified, but still a personal slight.
Aspirations were still higher. He briefly went off to Egypt and discovered a bunch of gnarly Egyptian stuff, but then the British destroyed his fleet and trapped his forces. Say, Napoleon, sir, you're not going to leave us here stuck in Egypt and return to France, are you? Nonsense, my boy. I would never dream of abandoning my loyal soldiers. Wow, what's that over there? On his return to Paris, Napoleon found himself to be extremely popular, and the government extremely unpopular, and he started getting some power-hungry ideas. Conveniently, a politician named Emmanuel Joseph Sieyès approached Napoleon and said, "Hey man, since you're so popular, do you want to help me stage a coup?" "Great idea! Let's stage a coup, and then I'll coup you." What? Napoleon, with the help of his politician brother, entered the government chamber, possibly got punched in the face, and finally his troops intimidated the council to dissolve the government and create a new constitution that basically made Napoleon a dictator. So there you have it, the French Revolution, born with the great promise of liberty and equality. The common people dared challenge an oppressive system that had existed for centuries. But before they knew it, they found liberty sidelined by terror, equality that possibly didn't quite hit the mark, and an absolute monarchy replaced by an absolute dictator. Napoleon began stabilizing French society. He restored the Catholic Church and got rid of that crazy calendar, among other things. But he remained ever ambitious. He was France's first consul, but he slept soundly at night dreaming of being something even bigger.
Yeah.
Napoleon's expansionist aspirations, combined with the
So, I mean, it's crazy how in history so many revolutions, not all, but so many result in essentially a more authoritarian regime than the one they overthrew. So they overthrew a really bad government and an oppressive government, and then they set up a complete tyranny. So obviously I'm thinking of the French Revolution with Napoleon, but also the Bolshevik Revolution with Lenin and Stalin. In England, the English Civil War, which is effectively a revolution, resulted in the dictatorship of Oliver Cromwell, who was way more authoritarian than Charles I ever was, to be honest. Like banned Christmas and stuff like that. So obviously there are some revolutions that don't, though. So like the American Revolution is a really interesting example of a revolution that went really well. And it resulted in freedoms being hugely increased, and not for everyone, but for a lot of the population. And we didn't see like George Washington become a dictator, but there seems to be quite a variety of outcomes to revolutions.
ongoing conflict in Europe would eventually lead the continent into a huge conflict known today as...
Yes. I don't know what. So that was really interesting. I quite clearly the Napoleonic Wars are next. I think there's on a series on this, so I will definitely do them at some point. But no, I love the parallels between like the French Revolution and other revolutions I know more about are so striking. It's fascinating, especially like the Russian Revolution. There's a lot of stuff I'm like that you're basically copying them, dude. Like, come on. But no, I really enjoyed that. I hope you guys did as well. If you haven't already, please do subscribe. But please leave a like. I'm told it helps in the algorithm somehow. And hope to see you again. Thank you.